The post war education era began in 1950 and ended in 1980. The defining characteristic of world politics at this time was the Cold War, which heavily influenced American education. With proxy conflicts in Korea and Vietnam and interventions in many other countries around the world, this conflict defined an era. Out of this conflict, the massive leaps in technology that occurred from things like the nuclear energy to the space race caused many to question the quality of the current US education system. The defining characteristic of American society at this time was the Civil Rights era. The Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 declared that segregation was illegal on the grounds that separate was not equal. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave equal rights to all Americans regardless of race, giving them the right to vote and other things like that. They even began busing black students to white schools in 1971 to promote diversity in the education system. Many people, such as Martin Luther King, Ruby Bridges, and Rosa Parks, were influential characters in this era that led to blacks earning the same equal rights as whites. The leaders of our countries recognized the changing world that we live in, so they decided that we need to make change to the education system. The biggest changes that they wanted to make was to increase the nationalization of the system. Pre-post war period, the education system was very decentralized, relying on local municipalities to make the choices about their students and what they were learning. Through federal funding, these presidents hoped to create a higher standard of education and help reach students that weren't necessarily reached before. Through the National Defense Education Act, Dwight D. Eisenhower increased funding for all levels of education, specifically focused on math and science areas. Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, which provided funding for primary and secondary education, helping pay for teachers, teaching teachers how to teach better, resources and materials needed in the classroom, and helping promote parental involvement with their students' learning. Another big change that we made was the Equal Educational Opportunity Act in 1974, which mandated that everyone should be offered the same education no matter of race, sex, national origin, or religion. And the culmination of the nationalization of the education system came in the founding of the Department of Education, which occurred in 1979, creating a federal body that oversaw the education of its populace. As the education system was changing, the American schools themselves were also changing after World War II. When all the soldiers came home after World War II, there was an explosion in the number of births that occurred, called the baby boom, thus doubling the population of school aged children from 1950 to 1970. This caused major problems in the school system because the capacity of the schools that were currently around was not enough to handle this new influx of children. Thus, new schools were created, and the school districts themselves were condensed to provide a more efficient, streamlined method for getting kids into schools. These schools were created on a much larger scale to service a much larger area of students, thus also creating large class sizes with commonly up to 35 and 40 students in the same classroom. Overcrowding was a large issue that was faced during this time. The new American school system also had to deal with the issue between the urban and rural divide of education. Rural schools often served different purposes for their students than their urban counterparts. These schools served as centers for their rural communities, with them often being the largest building around, so events and gatherings often occurred inside of them. These skills often also catered to their rural audience more so in that they offered a lot more machining skills, farm skills, and more vocational type skills that help these students go home and work on their parents' farms and things like this. These rural students also suffered many more challenges when it came to education, and they often had as up to a 10% higher dropout rate than their urban counterparts. And they also face issues such as transportation time because the condensing of schools that occurred during this time required many students to take long car rides or bus rides to get to school, many having to spend hours a day on buses. The student body was also rapidly changing during this time. The Civil Rights Act and increasing facilities and programs for special needs students made sure that everybody was able to attend the same school and get the same good education. Women also experienced a increase in their abilities and programs available to them at school due to things like Title IX, which allowed them equal access to athletic programs and clubs. A new curriculum was also developed during this time. Math and science came to heavy prominence, being the two most important subjects that were felt to be taught at schools during the time. And while math and science were very important, there was also developed a diverse set of basic subjects that were required for every student to learn. This ranged from the math and science to literature and history and English and reading and things like this. They also reimagined old topics and retaught them, such as things like US history, where instead of just teaching the basic things about colonial America and then the independence from Britain and up and towards the Civil War and things like this, instead, they also taught about the Native Americans and the history of that blacks have faced throughout US history and all of the tumultuous events around this. A changing society and a changing curriculum means that a new way of teaching was needed during this time. Teachers came up with many new ways of conveying the knowledge to their students, including things like inquiry oriented learning, problem solving development, issue centered learning, and hands on learning. By teaching their students to interact with each other and interact with the world around them, they were able to make better connections with the source material and things the students could relate to. This developed into a system of letting the student explore their own interests and not just teaching straight from the textbook. To facilitate these new teaching methods, teachers began to use a large variety of new materials in the classroom. New textbooks and reference materials were needed to help students along on their path to knowledge gathering and investigation, and new teaching devices, such as overhead projectors, were needed to help share new media forms with their students so they could bring things like pictures and videos into the classroom to give better learning opportunities for their students. New curriculums and new teaching methods led to a rise of a different set of influential educators at this time. People like Harold Rugg and George Counts, who were proponents of the progressivism method of teaching, uh, taught with the belief that education must be based on the principle that humans should be social with each other and they learn best while doing real activities with the real people around them. Another influential educator is somebody like Marcus Foster, who was the first black superintendent in America in a school in Philadelphia. This represents the change from a all-white school faculty to a mixed diverse group of people, which would be the faculty that we see today. And a third influential person is good old Mr. Rogers. During this time, the rise of the television occurred, and people like him, who were seen all the time on TV at night by kids, became very influential because they taught them things like good manners outside of school, reinforcing things that they learn in school. There is a large impact on modern teaching by the post war education era. We can see this greatest influence in the STEM programs that we have today. The hard drive for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics comes from the competition between the United States and the Soviets during the Cold War. Another impact is the diversification of content. Originally, before World War II, teaching was generally based around grammar and basic mathematics, while afterwards, they greatly diversified the requirements that every student had to achieve. This diversification of content also helped lead teachers to explore different teaching strategies that leads to better teaching and a furthering of education for the students. On a national level, the centralization and nationalization of the education system has continued to this day with things like Common Core, which sets a national standard for students across the country. This new focus on students' personal development and growth continues to this day and allows for students to be able to learn and grow in their own right instead of just relying on the growth of the class as a whole. Another great impact of this era was the inclusion of every member of society into the education system, allowing blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans to all coexist in the same classroom, and allowing people that might have special needs to be able to access the educational resources and time that they might require rather than other students.